This vignette about Dr. Chevalier Quixote Jackson, the man who invented endoscopy, is from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 27, Fathers and Mothers of American Medicine, Part 2. If you live in Philadelphia, you've almost certainly visited the Mütter Museum and its collection of medical curiosities. One of their most popular holdings is in the stack of drawers under the stairs on the ground floor. These drawers are filled with little oddities, coins, safety pins, religious medals, peanuts, children's jacks. The museum has 2,374 of these items. This is the culmination of a man's career. Dr. Chevalier Jackson had dedicated his career to developing the tools and the skills to retrieve small objects accidentally aspirated into the lungs or partially swallowed and stuck in the esophagus. More than 80% of his patients were 15 years old or under. He is the father of American endoscopy. Chevalier Quixote Jackson grew up speaking both English and French in western Pennsylvania on a farm near where there was drilling for oil, which is an industry in its infancy. In the 1870s, drilling tools would become lost and irretrievable in the pits. Jackson observed this happening and fabricated an instrument that successfully retrieved the errant drill bits and other tools. He was in his teens. This was Jackson's first successful retrieval of a foreign body from a tubular structure. He studied at Western Pennsylvania University, now the University of Pittsburgh, and decided that he wanted a career in medicine. While in college, he took up woodworking and the painting of glassware and china, a job which required meticulous skills and patience in addition to artistic creativity. His younger brother, Charles Byzantine Jackson, born in 1870, also became a physician. Chevalier Jackson came to Jefferson Medical College in 1884 and took every opportunity to observe the work of Dr. Charles Eucharis de Medici-Séjoux and others who were working in the newly established dispensary for diseases of the nose and throat. It was here that he discovered the works of Sir Morel Mackenzie, the father of English laryngoscopy. Mackenzie and others had learned from sword swallowers that if you tilted your head up like a baby bird about to feed, you would have a clear, straight channel through the mouth and down the esophagus. Sword swallowing as entertainment has been documented to centuries before the Christian era in Egypt. It was part of street theater during the Middle Ages, but it had begun to die out in the mid-19th century. The best-known North American sword swallower of his time was Fred McClone, a French-Canadian who performed under the name of, believe it or not, Chevalier Quixote from 1878 to the early 20th century. There is no record of Chevalier Quixote ever meeting Chevalier Jackson. If you are up to it, there are several clips of sword swallowing on YouTube. After medical school graduation in 1886, Jackson, not yet 21 years old, went back to Pittsburgh and decided to specialize in laryngology, the study of the larynx, or voice box. With his side gig of painting china, especially lampshades, he came up with a substantial sum of $126 to pay passage to London so he could study with Mackenzie. But he was very disappointed to see the crude tools being used by a founder of a specialty, and he determined that he would do better. An endoscope is any device that allows a practitioner to look inside organs of the body without making a surgical incision. The first true endoscope was invented around 1808 by Philip Bozzini, but it was limited by not having its own light source. Variations in lighting systems followed: candles reflected in mirrors, oil lamps, burning magnesium wires, and loops of platinum. It really wasn't until Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb in 1879 that a safe, reliable source of light could be crafted. Using a tiny incandescent light bulb in 1886 allowed Johann von Michelitz to develop the first usable esophagoscope. By 1890, Jackson had developed an endoscope that he felt was worthy of the name. His distal lamp, or light carrier as he called it, consisted of a handmade battery-charged lamp the size of a grain of wheat, mounted at the end of an exceedingly thin rod that slipped inside the rigid scope. With another invention of his, a long forceps, he successfully removed a partial dental plate from the esophagus of an adult. Then, using a smaller version of these instruments, he retrieved a coin from the esophagus of a child. He practiced constantly until he had his technique perfected, using either his right or his left hand. He was so skilled that when he saw an open safety pin lodged in the esophagus, he could gently push it into the stomach where he had more room to work, close the safety pin, and then carefully extract it. Now, as was the custom of the day, he reported his findings through the medical literature, and then he generously made his instruments available to other physicians. To his horror, Jackson saw that the esophagoscope in the hands of an inexperienced endoscopist produced disastrous results: perforations, infections, bleeding, death. He immediately notified the manufacturer to cease making, selling, and distributing his invention. He then developed elaborate protocols in individual instruction to be certain that his tools and techniques would be used safely and effectively. His students started with direct study of cadavers. They then moved on to removing foreign bodies from a rubber tube which served as an esophagus. Next, it was anesthetized dogs. The dogs were apparently awakened, none the worse for the wear. Finally, under direct supervision by Jackson, the student would be allowed to demonstrate the technique first on an adult and then on a child. In 1916, at age 50, Jackson left Pittsburgh and accepted the professorship of laryngology at Jefferson Medical College, where he worked the rest of his life. At one point, he was department chair of laryngology at all 5 medical schools in town: Jefferson, University of Pennsylvania, Temple, Women's, and the Graduate School of Medicine. And he served as president of Women's Medical College from 1935 to 1941. These professorships did not involve a salary or an endowment. He had to make a living by seeing patients, but he never turned down a charity case, and he frequently gave money to the families of children he treated so they could buy medicine or even return home. Jackson also developed instruments that allowed him to dilate a stricture in the esophagus, a common problem among children who had swallowed lye. For them, Jackson's procedure was literally life-saving. By the 1920s, a commercial product called Red Devil lye had made its way onto the market to replace the milder homemade lye of most rural households. It came in a colorful, highly attractive, bright red package with a smiling cartoon devil on the front, along with bucolic pictures of a house and a barn. The devil on the box took on somewhat mystical qualities among rural Southerners who would protect their property by burying a box of unopened red devil at each of the 4 corners of their property. This protected them from evil spirits. Don't laugh. Many American Roman Catholics attempting to sell their house will bury a statue of St. Joseph in their backyard to assist in the sale. I understand that the statue has to be buried head first, about a foot down. And from 1987 to 2008, the city of Philadelphia lived under the curse of William Penn, assuring that no sports team would win a world championship because buildings were now being raised taller than Billy Penn's hat. This, too, was solved with a small statue. Housewives use lye to make soap, unclog drains, clean floors, peel peach skins, make hominy, homony's dried corn kernels treated with an alkali. The lye in the eye-catching box looked like sugar, and when mixed with water, it looked like milk. When swallowed, inadvertently or otherwise, lye is not technically poisonous. Its chemical activity is neutralized by the time it reaches the stomach, and it has no systemic effects on its victim. But it causes devastating burns to the lining of the esophagus on its way down. The scar tissue shrivels the healthy tissue. The esophagus narrows and stricture forms. Food and eventually liquid cannot pass. After treating far too many children with esophageal lye burns, Jackson determined to go to the source and prevent the problems. For more than 15 years, he lobbied at the local, state, national level and was rewarded when in March 1927 President Calvin Coolidge signed into law the Federal Caustic Poison Act. This required that a poison and antidote label be placed on all packages containing lye and other caustic agents. Their heart was in the right place, but as a retired emergency physician, I will tell you that the instructions were not only wrong, they would probably worsen the chemical burn. They say, quote, "If lye is accidentally taken internally, immediately give the patient about twice the quantity taken of vinegar or lemon juice, slightly diluted with water." End quote. Now, the combination of a mild acid with a harsh alkali is supposed to neutralize the lye. What it does is set up an exothermic or heat-producing reaction, and it worsens the coagulative necrosis or dead tissue. As word of Jackson's successes spread, patients flocked to see him from around the world. And Jackson kept improving on his devices. A bronchoscope with a light on the tip will let you see the tracheobronchial tree, but it is otherwise not very useful unless you have other proper instruments. Long, slender forceps with so-called alligator teeth to grasp the foreign bodies, scissors or punches to take a biopsy of a suspicious lesion, devices to expand in place and open a previously closed hollow organ. Jackson invented all of these things. He never patented a single one, and he never made a penny from his inventions. He firmly believed that patents frequently restricted scientific advancement, and surgical instruments should be freely available, quote, "for the good of humanity," end quote. Another way he was ahead of his time was to discourage handshaking, which he knew would spread germs. He suggested instead that people bow to each other. He also refused to touch a doorknob while not wearing his thin gray gloves, which he had made especially for him. His acquaintances noted that he trusted two things, his eyes and his hands. Michelle the Choking Doll, who preceded Resusci Annie by several decades, was another of his inventions. Michelle was used for practice of his techniques. She now resides in the Mütter Museum. 8 years after his mandatory retirement at age 65, Jackson wrote his autobiography in 1938. It was a bestseller. Although he and his wife Alice were together for half a century, he covered his courtship and marriage in 3 sentences of his autobiography. Quote, "A patient, Josephine W. White, when coming for treatment, brought her sister Alice and their mother with her. They were all charming people. I married Alice." End quote. That's it. That is his entire marriage right there in 3 sentences. His successes were also reported in a June 1938 issue of the New Yorker magazine. In 1941, author Eudora Welty published a short story called A Worn Path in Atlantic Monthly magazine. It concerned a young boy of color who had swallowed lye milk and the heroic efforts of his grandmother to save him. The grandmother's name was Phoenix Jackson. Some Welty scholars feel that the name Jackson was chosen as an honor to Dr. Chevalier. Now, 3 times between 1911 and 1917, Chevalier Jackson had been sidelined with tuberculosis. He used this time to study and to write. In 1918, he purchased Sunrise Mill, a 200-acre site located on the Swamp Creek, straddling the townships of Upper Frederick, Lower Frederick, and Limerick. It was his country retreat. The property included a woodworking mill where Jackson continued to build and perfect his own medical instruments. For the 40 years he lived there, Jackson commuted the 35-plus miles to and from the city by car and train. He was very protective of the privacy of his family home, which he shared with wife Alice, son Chevalier Lawrence Jackson, another highly accomplished laryngologist, sister-in-law Josephine White, mother-in-law Susan White, and several caretakers. Acquaintances who visited would comment later about the array of instruments laid out on the dining room table before Jackson would carve a turkey. His granddaughter sold the property to Montgomery County in 1971. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1977. Jackson's name is on 238 single-author articles, 473 articles on which he is a co-author, 12 textbooks, and 6 monographs. His early work had concerned instruments and techniques. His later works expanded on current and possible future uses of his inventions: early diagnosis of lung cancers, aid for surgeons in massive hemoptysis, that is, blood from the lung, by selectively doing endotracheal intubations into only one main stem bronchus to ventilate the patient and avoid soilage of the unaffected lung. Pneumonography and bronchography using bismuth bisulfite. Pleuroscopy and thoracoscopy as forerunners of VATS, video-assisted thoracic surgery. Even transthoracic, that is, through the chest wall, removal of foreign bodies from the lung, using biplane fluoroscopes. He also did not hesitate to train and hire women whom he treated as equals. While at Temple, one of his protégés and then partners was pioneering woman bronchoscopist Emily Van Loon, MD, FACS. About 15 years ago, I gave a medical history talk at the Springfield Residence Senior Living Community in Wynmore, where my father was an inmate, as he used to call it. And I mentioned Jackson in the talk. Afterwards, a woman approached me and said that she had for many years been Dr. Jackson's scrub nurse. Even 50 years after his death, she had nothing but good to say about him, how he treated everybody in the procedure suite equally. In addition to being an excellent teacher in the laboratory and the operating room, Jackson was known for his skills in the classroom. Because of his ambidexterity, he would use a piece of chalk in both hands and simultaneously sketch the lungs and bronchial system. He could also write his first name with his left hand while simultaneously writing his last name with his right hand, and was known to draw a circle with his left hand and drawing a box with his right. But he had no true friends. His peers revered him for his work, but described him as sadly unknowable, cold, recoiling, socially unavailable, inaccessible, even phobically incapable of company. He did not drink alcohol. He went to bed at 9 p.m. and arose at 4:30 a.m. for his entire adult life. In 1929, at age 64, Dr. Chevalier Jackson was awarded the Elliott Cresson Medal from the Franklin Institute. But he was far from finished. In 1935, he was nominated for but did not receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. He returned to the classroom to teach during World War II. He was still peer-reviewing and editing for the Archives of Otolaryngology up until shortly before his death at age 93 in August 1958. Chevalier Jackson was interred in a modest mausoleum at West Laurel Hill Cemetery, Ashland Section, Lot 10. He had purchased the mausoleum used in 1943 when the former owner opted to move his wife's remains to another section of the cemetery. It had been built by John M. Gessler's sons, 39th and Woodlawn, for $7,500. The former owner's name was removed and replaced with Chevalier Jackson. At his death, it was estimated that Chevalier Jackson had personally saved 5,000 lives, and that people taught by him probably had saved 500,000 more. The name Chevalier, a knight of the lower order, was the perfect one for this inventor, teacher, physician, scholar, artist, and humanitarian. A young Chevalier Lawrence Jackson, 1900-1961, was an honors student in languages at the University of Pennsylvania. He shared a love of French with his father. He developed a penchant for opera and later became president of the Philadelphia Opera Company. He was also an expert bronchoscopist. He took over direction of the overseas instructional clinics. He was more than competent as a medical illustrator and authored several advanced textbooks on peroral surgery. After World War II, research in throat and lung illnesses, as in most other fields, was increasingly concentrated on cancer, and the younger Jackson contributed much in that area. He died in 1961, 3 years after his father, and is interred in the family vault. You've been listening to an excerpt from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 27, Fathers and Mothers of American Medicine, Part 2. It is one of hundreds of biographical vignettes to be found among the stones at both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West Cemetery. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and biographical bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, are available free wherever you listen to podcasts. They are researched and created by me, Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University. You can contact me at jrlexjr1947 @gmail.com.